On the morning of the 24th of June, 1565, the sentries on the walls of Birgu saw something moving in the water. It was drifting toward them on the tide from the fort that had stopped answering the day before. Crosses, wooden crosses, floating, and nailed to each one what was left of a man. They had been the garrison of Fort St. Elmo. The Turkish commander had ordered the dead beheaded and their bodies fixed to the timber and pushed out into the harbour so that the men in Birgu would have to look at them. The men in Birgu looked. Then the guns of St. Angelo answered. They did not fire a shot. The Grand Master had given an order of his own that morning. Every Turkish prisoner inside the fortress was to be beheaded and their heads loaded into the cannon and fired into the Turkish camp. The man who gave that order was 70 years old. He had entered the order about 50 years before and bound himself by 3 vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. The Knights of St. John had been recognized as a religious order by Pope Paschal II in 1113, 452 years before that morning. They had not been founded to fight anybody, but to keep a hospital in Jerusalem for sick pilgrims. The Church set them beside monks, answerable to the Pope alone. So when you ask how 600 knights held Malta, correct the question. 600 was the number of knights. Behind them stood thousands more, Spanish and Italian soldiers, and 3,000 Maltese. And they were not knights in the way you are picturing. They were monks with cannon. And they were running out of places to be monks in. They had lost Jerusalem. They had lost Acre. In 1522, the Ottomans took Rhodes, which the order had held for 200 years, and let the survivors sail away. Then, for 8 years, they had nowhere at all. A sovereign order of the Church living on other princes' charity while it looked for somewhere to put its convent. In 1530, the Emperor Charles V gave them Malta, a limestone island with almost no water and almost no timber, which the order's own inspectors had reported on with something close to contempt. They took it. It was what was on offer, and everything turns on this. When the Turkish fleet came over the horizon in 1565, the Knights of St. John were not defending Christendom's frontier. Christendom had frontiers everywhere. They were defending the only ground they had. Victor Malia Milanes, who has spent a career on this order, argues that what stood to be wiped out in 1565 was not Christian Europe, but the hospital itself. That is his judgment, not a proven fact. The order still held estates across Europe, but it had nowhere else to be a sovereign order, and it had spent 8 years finding out what that was like. And there is something here the triumphal version leaves out. The Knights of St. John were corsairs. The order ran a raiding operation out of Malta under its own flag. Galleys that took Ottoman shipping, seized the cargoes, and sold or kept the people aboard. Licensed, lawful by the standards of the age, and still slave-taking. The Senate of Venice had a phrase for them: corsairs parading crosses. Their most famous captain, a knight called Romagus, took 300 people at the mouth of the Nile in 1561. 2 years later, he came home with more than 500. Francisco Balbi, who fought on these walls for the order, gives 2 reasons the Sultan came. One was ambition, an empire looking further west. The other was fury at what the order's raiding was costing it. Historians weigh those differently. The one who leans hardest on the raiding is careful to call it the occasion rather than the cause. Ottoman designs on the middle of the Mediterranean were a century old before Romagus was born, but it belongs in the story. These were men under vows. They were taking slaves. And the fleet that came for them did not come out of nowhere. They knew it was coming from January. The order's own council minutes record it. The recruiting in Naples, a war tax laid on every priory in Europe, and the order to bring every sack of grain on the island inside the walls. That is not a chronicle written afterwards. That is a religious order doing arithmetic on its own survival in the minutes of a committee meeting. On the 18th of May at dawn, the Armada came over the horizon. The next day, something between 23 and 25,000 Ottoman troops came ashore. The Turks went first for the smallest thing on the island. Fort St. Elmo was a star-shaped work on the point of the peninsula, and it mattered for one reason. It guarded the mouth of the harbour. The Ottoman general looked at it and concluded a few days would be enough. Inside were roughly 100 knights and 700 soldiers, a misleading number because men were rowed across to replace the dead almost every night for a month. The bombardment opened at the end of May and did not stop. Within a fortnight, it was not a fort anymore. It was a shape in the smoke that men kept standing up inside. In the second week of June, the knights inside did something that does not appear in the legend. They wrote to La Valette and told him the truth. Holding St. Elmo was now certain death. They asked to come out and die in the open, fighting. He would not have it. By the accounts that come down to us, he offered to send volunteers to replace them, and the men in the fort withdrew the request and stayed. It is the coldest arithmetic of the siege. Every day St. Elmo stood was a day the Ottoman army spent on a fort instead of on Birgu. Whether it was the right call, historians still argue. What is not in doubt is that the men inside understood exactly what was being asked of them. St. Elmo held for about a month. On the 18th of June, a shot struck the earthworks beside Dragut, the most feared corsair commander in the Mediterranean, and the flying stone opened his head. Accounts disagree about the day he died and whose gun fired the shot. Some say his own. He did not live to see the fort taken. On the 23rd, it fell. The defenders lost something like 1,500 men. Estimates of the Ottoman dead run from 6,000 to 8,000. Spent on a fort their general had expected to cost him a few days. Of the knights inside, effectively none came out. The accounts differ over the handful who did. Some say 9 Maltese soldiers, some record knights taken alive by Dragut's corsairs. What they agree on is how the survivors got out, into the water and across the harbour to St. Angelo, under fire. The story is almost always told as 600 knights and a supporting cast. 3,000 Maltese militia fought this siege, and at St. Elmo, the men who came out alive were islanders. The next day is the feast of St. John the Baptist, the patron saint of the Order of St. John. They lost the fort on the eve of their own patron's feast. And that is where this film began. The crosses in the water on the morning of the 24th. The heads fired from the guns of St. Angelo in reply. You can account for the first. 16th century siege warfare had its customs, and terror was one of them. The second is ours. Executing prisoners is wrong. It was wrong in 1565 by the Church's own moral teaching, and no vow and no provocation turns it into something else. That is a judgment about an act, and it is not a hard one to make. The judgment about the man is harder, and we are not going to make it. La Valette was 70, 4 weeks into a siege he expected to lose, looking across the water at the bodies of men he had ordered to stay and die. What he knew, what he feared, how much of it was decision and how much was rage. None of that is recoverable. The Church has always been more careful about souls than about acts, and so will we be. So we will say both. The order he gave was evil. The man who gave it is not ours to sentence. And this was the same island in the same summer where an order founded to keep a hospital for sick pilgrims was doing the killing. After St. Elmo, the siege settled into the thing it would be for the rest of the summer. The Ottomans turned their guns on Birgu and Senglea and began working through them. They mined under the walls. They came over the top in assault after assault. In August, a section of wall at Senglea came down. The attack went into the breach, and it was still not enough. Malta in July and August is a furnace. No clean water, no shade. Bodies in the ditches that nobody could reach, disease in both camps. And by the end of it, as one historian puts it, besiegers and besieged had reached exactly the same pitch of exhaustion. The order was not winning. It was continuing, which was the only thing left to do, and it did that for another 11 weeks. On the 7th of September, a Spanish relief force of about 8,000 men landed at St. Paul's Bay. The Ottoman commanders had been on that island nearly 4 months. They had lost their best commander, an enormous number of men, and the campaigning season. On the 8th of September, they lifted the siege and began putting their guns back aboard. Then Mustafa found out how small that relief force actually was, turned his army around, and landed it again. There was one more battle, inland, near Naxar. He lost that too. Then the fleet went for good. The 8th of September, the day the siege lifted, is in the church's calendar as the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. We are not going to tell you what that means. What can be said is what the people who lived through it did with it. The order and the Maltese kept that day every year from then on and keep it still. They call it Our Lady of Victories. And Malta has since folded 2 later sieges into the same feast. The survivors sang the Te Deum in the conventual church of St. Lawrence in Birgu, in a wrecked town in the smell of the dead, most of the congregation wounded. Francisco Balbi, 60 years old, an arquebusier who had spent 4 months on those walls, wrote down what he heard. Never, he said, did music sound so sweet to human ears as did the peals of our bells on this day. You will hear it said that the Knights of Malta saved Europe that summer, and that the Ottoman Empire never recovered. That is not true, and it is worth saying plainly. The year after the siege, an Ottoman fleet burned 3 towns on the Italian coast, and the Sultan marched into Hungary with an army far larger than the one that had failed at Malta. Cyprus was invaded 5 years later. Tunis 9 years after that. Vienna was besieged again in 1683. The historians who work on this period do not think Malta turned the Mediterranean, and that it did not begin the Ottoman decline is not seriously disputed. But something was saved on Malta, and it was not Europe. It was the order. They had been driven out of Jerusalem, out of Acre, and out of Rhodes, and Malta was the only ground they had. Losing it would not have killed every knight in Europe. The order held estates from Portugal to Poland, but it would have taken the last place it could be itself. A sovereign order, on its own soil, doing what it was founded to do. It did not lose it. The order is still here. 9 centuries after that hospital in Jerusalem, still running hospitals and ambulance corps in something like 120 countries. Most of its members today are lay. A small professed class still takes the 3 vows. That is what those men held the island for. Not a continent. Their own house. For more true stories from 2,000 years of Christian history, subscribe. A new one every week.